Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at a medical device I'm sure you've all seen used in movies and TV shows. At least I know I have. It's the manual resuscitator.
Yep. Sometimes called a bag or an AMBU bag.
All right, exactly. AMB bag. Now that's a name that I always thought sounded kind of funny.
Well, it actually comes from the company that first made them.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It stands for Air Mask Bag Unit.
So it's like an acronym.
Pretty much.
That's pretty cool. I always just assumed it was some made-up medical term.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's get into the actual device itself. We're taking a deep dive into a training manual for these things. And one of the first things it talks about is the two main types.
Flow-inflating and self-inflating.
Right. So what's the difference?
Well, flow-inflating bags are like some older anesthesia bags. You need a constant flow of gas, usually oxygen, to inflate it. When you squeeze, you're pushing that gas straight into the patient's lungs.
So it's kind of like a direct line?
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay. So then what about self-inflating? How do those work if they don't need the constant gas flow?
They use the air around them. They have like a spring-loaded system. So when you squeeze and release, it draws in fresh air.
Huh. So it's kind of like a pump.
Yeah, like a spring-loaded pump.
Interesting. The manual also mentions something about different types of valves inside the self-inflating bags. Can you explain what those do?
Sure. So the valves are there to make sure the air flows in the right direction. To the patient when you squeeze and out when they exhale, one type is a diaphragm valve.
Okay.
It's kind of like a little duck's bill inside. When you squeeze, it flattens out, directing air towards the patient.
Yeah.
And then it pops back up on exhalation to let the air out, a separate valve.
Wow. A duckbill valve. Never thought I'd hear that in a medical context.
Yeah. But it works.
That's pretty amazing, though, how these tiny little parts can make such a big difference in how the whole thing works.
It's all about precision engineering with medical devices.
Makes sense. Speaking of making sense, there was another part of the manual that really caught my eye. It mentioned different sizes, like for babies and adults, so I'm guessing it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing?
Nope. Not at all. The size of the bag determines how much air gets delivered with each squeeze. So you need to use the right size for the patient.
That makes sense. You wouldn't want to give a tiny baby the same amount of air as a grown adult.
Exactly. Too much air pressure could be really dangerous.
Okay. That makes sense. So besides the size, anything else that stood out to you in the manual? Like any special features?
Yeah, the pop-off valve, it's on bags meant for infants and children.
What does it do?
It acts as a pressure release valve. It makes sure you don't deliver too much pressure to their airways.
Oh, that's a good safety feature.
Yeah. You don't want to hurt those tiny lungs.
So we've talked about the different types of bags, the valves inside them, and even some safety features. But what about the oxygen itself? I mean, how do you actually control how much oxygen the patient is getting?
Well, the manual talked about something called FiO2.
FiO2?
Yeah, it's the fraction of inspired oxygen. And there are a few ways to control that with a manual resuscitator.
Okay.
Well, one way is the oxygen flow rate. Higher flow rate usually means higher FiO2. And then there's the reservoir.
The reservoir.
Yeah. It can increase the concentration of oxygen being delivered.
Okay. So those seem pretty straightforward. But then the manual said something that kind of threw me off. It said that bagging faster actually decreases the amount of oxygen delivered. How does that work?
It's a little counterintuitive. I know. But basically, when you bag too quickly, you don't give the oxygen enough time to fill the bag all the way.
Ah. So you're just pushing air around instead of pure oxygen?
Right. So it's better to do slower, controlled breaths. That way you deliver more oxygen to the patient.
Wow. I would have thought that more squeezes meant more oxygen, but I guess that's not always the case. So we've covered a lot about the bag itself and the oxygen, but what about actually getting the air to the patient? The manual talked a lot about the face mask and how important it is to apply it correctly.
It's really crucial.
Yeah. I can imagine if there's no good seal, then all that work with the bag and the oxygen is kind of pointless.
You got it. Absolutely. Without a good seal, you're just wasting your energy.
So it's not just about slapping the mask on and squeezing the bag.
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
There's a technique to it. You have to think of the face mask in 3 parts.
3 parts?
Yeah. The body, the seal, and the connector. The body's the main part of the mask. The seal is the soft part that makes contact with the face. And the connector is where you attach it to the bag.
Okay. So you need to make sure all 3 of those parts are working together correctly.
Right. And you need to choose the right size mask for the patient, too. But once you have that, it's all about positioning.
So like making sure the bridge of the mask is sitting right on the bridge of their nose.
Exactly. You use your fingers to gently position the mask, making sure the seal is snug around the mouth and nose. But you also need to position the patient's head and jaw correctly to keep that seal airtight.
I imagine that takes a bit of practice.
It does. But like anything in medicine, it becomes second nature with experience. The key is to tilt the head back slightly and lift the chin. That opens up the airway. But you don't want to overdo it and hyperextend the neck, especially with kids.
So it's all about finding that balance.
Right? Too much or too little can cause problems.
Speaking of problems, the manual also talked about some potential hazards when using a manual resuscitator.
Right. There are definitely some things that can go wrong if you're not careful.
Yeah. Like what?
Well, one of the biggest ones is giving the patient too much air pressure. That can happen if the valve gets stuck, or if you squeeze the bag while they're trying to exhale, or if there's something blocking their airway.
So you really have to pay attention to what you're doing?
Yeah. You need to be aware of the patient's breathing and make sure the equipment is working right.
What happens if you give them too much pressure?
It can cause some serious complications, like a pneumothorax.
A pneumothorax. What's that?
It's when air leaks into the space between the lung and the chest wall.
Mm.
It can be really dangerous.
Oh, wow. The manual also mentions some issues that can happen with the valves themselves.
Right. A bad valve can cause all sorts of problems. It can leak air during inhalation so the patient isn't getting enough. And it can make it harder to keep a consistent pressure in the airway.
So it's super important to make sure the equipment is in good working order before you use it.
Absolutely. You need to check the bag, the valves, everything, make sure there are no cracks or tears, make sure it inflates properly, that kind of thing.
What about the pressure relief valves? The manual mentioned those too.
Those are important for safety. They release excess pressure if it builds up in the system.
Right. So if they're not set right, they could cause problems too.
Exactly. They might not release the pressure when they should, or they might release it too early. Either way, it's not good.
So using a manual resuscitator correctly is a lot more complicated than I thought.
It's not just about squeezing a bag. You have to understand the mechanics of the device. You have to know how to use it properly, and you have to be aware of the potential risks.
And on top of all that, you have to stay calm in a stressful situation.
That's probably the hardest part, but it's also the most important. If you panic, you're not going to be able to help anyone.
Very true. So it seems like the human element is just as important as the technology when it comes to using a manual resuscitator.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The device itself is just a tool. It's the person using it who makes all the difference.
That's a good point to remember, I think. It's easy to get caught up in the technical details, but ultimately it's the skill and judgment of the user that matters most.
Exactly. And that's true for a lot of medical devices, not just manual resuscitators.
That's a great takeaway from this deep dive. I think technology is amazing, but it's the people who use it that really make a difference.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah. It really makes you appreciate the training and expertise that healthcare professionals have.
For sure. It's not something you can just pick up overnight.
So looking back at this deep dive, what would you say are some of the biggest things we learned about manual resuscitators?
Well, for starters, there's the different types, flow-inflating versus self-inflating.
Right. And all those valves inside.
Yeah, the diaphragm valves, the leaf valve.
Those were pretty cool.
Yeah, definitely not something you'd think about unless you really dug into it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the whole thing about sizing and making sure you use the right bag for the patient.
And controlling the oxygen delivery.
Right. FiO2, all that good stuff.
And let's not forget about the face mask. Turns out applying that correctly is a lot more complicated than I thought.
It's definitely more than just slapping it on. You got to get a good seal. You got to position the head and jaw just right.
It's a lot to keep track of.
It is. But it's all important for making sure the patient gets the air they need.
So I guess the main takeaway from all this is that manual resuscitators are pretty complex devices. There's a lot more to them than meets the eye.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to have trained professionals using them.
Exactly, because at the end of the day, it's not just about the technology, it's about the people using it.
Right. The skill, the knowledge, the judgment, all of that plays a role.
Well, I don't know about you, but I feel like I've learned a ton about manual resuscitators today.
Me too. It's been a fascinating deep dive.
And for anyone listening out there, if you're ever in a situation where you need to use one of these things, hopefully this deep dive will have given you a better understanding of how they work.
Knowledge is power, as they say.
That's the truth. And speaking of knowledge, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining me today and sharing your expertise. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise. Always happy to talk about medical devices.
And to everyone listening, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you on the next deep dive.